오늘도 이른 아침에 많이 나와주셔서 대단히 감사합니다. 그럼 회의를 곧 시작하도록 하겠습니다. Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This morning we have a very, very distinguished two speakers. It just happened that two speakers in town at the very moment, so we're very fortunate to have both speakers this morning. Professor Yukiko Fukagawa, who is currently teaching at Waseda University in Japan, is the leading economist in Japan studying in Korea. Of course, she is a very influential economist in Japan, and particularly policy making and business, the management and the strategies and so forth. But in any case, Professor Fukagawa contributes very insightful commentaries and columns in major newspapers in Korea, and she spent actually a number of years in Korea. I just heard from her that and many years ago, when she worked for JETRO, she officed in this very building a few decades ago. But anyway, she spent a year in Korean University learning Korean, so she speaks Korean better than myself. And she briefly worked at the KIT, Korean Institute for Economics and Trade. In fact, she worked there. I was president of that institution before she came here. But in any case, she is providing through her lectures and commentaries and columns in Korean newspapers and media, provide very useful policy recommendations to the policymakers and business strategists. In any case, I appreciate very much for her to come to Seoul to meet with you and to share her insightful views on the achievements of so-called Abenomics and the outlook. Particularly, she will share her insights on Japan's labor market reform, which is the key to many countries, including our own, for continuous economic growth and sustained prosperity. But in any case, Professor Fukagawa, in addition, she will talk about Korea-Japan economic cooperation and the future of the two countries' cooperation. And then we have Dr. Kenneth Courtis. We've been friends for many years. In fact, when he was chief economist at the Deutsche Bank, he came to Seoul for this very forum to give a lecture that was sometime in 1990s. And then he talked at this forum a number of times afterward. But in any case, Ken Courtis currently is leading his own consultancy firm, and I gather there's a number of important firms working in more than 20 countries and so many offices and all over the world. He is now chairman of Stafford Investment Holdings. I consider him still leading I would call business economist. He's engaged in mostly consulting business leaders, and actually he advises many countries, central banks, central bank governors, and major policymakers, including, of course, U.S. And he's a very, very versatile economist, a lot of ideas, and that's why he's very popular among leading global business managers and policymakers all over the world. In fact, he is real cosmopolitan. I just asked him which city is his current home city, but he has an apartment in Paris, but he's all over. He just flew to Seoul last night from London, and in fact, he lived more than 25 years in Asia, mostly in Hong Kong and Tokyo and everywhere. So Ken Courtis is everywhere, and his idea is so bright, and we are very, very fortunate to have him. In fact, he happened to be in town, so Fukagawa said the lecture was scheduled, so I asked him to join this one, so we're very, very fortunate to have him. Well, with no further ado, I would ask Dr. Song Young-jin to go ahead with this meeting. Well, thank you very much.
Without much further ado, I'd like to invite Professor Fukagawa to share her ideas and views about Japan's labor reform and implications for Korea. Mr. Fukagawa?
Hello. Good morning, everyone. 안녕하세요. Sometimes when I'm supposed to speak something in Korea, it should be more natural to speak in Koreans. But since this is an international or global forum, I would like to speak in English. My topic today is a labor reform in Japan, which is very much focused after 5 years of so-called Abenomics. And I think as a kind of very rapidly aging society, I know Korea is also interested in a labor reform constantly. So, and especially after this administrations in Korea, I mean, I've been having a lot of people from the especially government saying that, oh, you're suffering from labor shortage, but we are suffering from a very loose labor market. So why don't you hire more Korean young graduates, this kind of thing. So labor reform should be one of the interesting topics, so that's why. And we are in that kind of shape, so many people are trying to seek for a good work-life balance, but it should be very difficult. So that's an icon. So I would like to talk something about the 5 years of Abenomics, and the difference is our labor reform is very much motivated by the market rather than the political reasons. well, we've been suffering from a labor shortage very severely, and now probably Japanese economy is under the lowest unemployment rate now, and not because we are doing great, but mostly because we are too aged. But we've got to do something on it. So that's one topic, and other issues is Japan-Korea cooperation. So we are under the so-called Abenomics too. So, well, probably as a foreigners, you might not be so much familiar with the so-called Abenomics. So Abenomics is divided into two stages. One is Abenomics first, is there's a kind of huge macro packages. So we started to have an enormous intensity or the efforts of quantitative monetary easing that has been following the US and Europe. And then yen was naturally very much depreciated, and the government has committed to fiscal expansions also, and there was a certain growth strategies. So as a result, so all this effort has been dedicated to change this very sticky deflationary kind of mind in Japan. As you know well, Japanese export dependency is almost as 1/3 of Korea. So we are very much dependent on the domestic market, and of course, naturally, the consumption is the most important things. But since people just never abandon the ideas of deflation, so never buys the things or services, well, let's just postpone it when the price will fall down. And we've been in that way for so many years. But after this big shock, some parts has started to work. So the brightest sectors is a corporate sector, and many Japanese listed companies have seen best records in revenue. And then the company has started to invest somewhat. So investment was okay. But unlike Korea, the asset effect has been very much limited because it pushed up the equity price, but that was okay. But the land price has remained very stagnant. So the asset effect was not working that fine. And one of the very painful issue for us is even though we've been suffering labor shortage, the pace of the wage hike is very slow. It's very, economics, economists try to have some Philip curves when we talked about the unemployment rate and the wage hike speed. But that is very much flattered in Japan. But it's not only Japan, but it's quite common in every mature economies, even in the US and Europe. But the speed is very slow. And since the wage never goes up, the consumption never picks up, and then people tend to come back to the familiar, sticky, deflationary kind of ideas. So that's a result of Abenomics 1. I think I should do this. Well, this is the green part is Abenomics 1, QQE, flexible budgetary spending, and the Japan revitalization plan that is called the growth strategies, and that lasted for 3 years from 2013 to 2015. And then we entered into the Abenomics second, and that has targeted GDP of 600 trillion yen. This is not dollar, unfortunately, it's yen. And the base birth rate of 1.8 per couple, and the social security for elderly care, because we've started to suffer the labor shortage, but many people had to leave their job because they have to take care of their older parents. So the number is already is getting 500,000. So let's save those people as a labor force, and that's incentives. And then it lasted only 1 year or so because of the whole political turmoil. And then other things have started to be focused. It's future investment strategies, and that's something on like Industry 4.0, so this kind of things. Probably I will be able to explain later. And but the rest of the whole packages has been very much concentrated on the human capitals and the labor reform. And that's because as a result of the whole sequencing process, we finally got the ideas that we need substantial reform in terms of human capitals and labor reform. So Abenomics too, because of the labor shortage, and but we are very much aged already, one of the super aged societies in the world. So in a very short time we started to feel the labor shortage, and then in terms to push up the economies, the things that we can do is either increase the labor input more, or the rest of the productivity. I mean, we can input the capital, labor, or the rest, like innovations or technologies, and that's called total factor productivity. So since the capital investment is going on, what's left for Japan to do is either to increase the labor input and TFP. So of course, in terms of total factor productivity, we've been pushing a lot of industrial policies to invent some new technologies. So Industrial 4.0, Industrial Society 5.0, that is database, AI-based kind of whole civil administration in Japan is terrible in terms of productivity, so let's do it, this kind of things. And also, as a growth strategy, Japan agreed with the FTA with EU finally, and we have Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, unfortunately without US, but hopefully we wish the US to come back. So TPP, and in terms of ASEAN plus 3, Japan, Korea, China, we are still negotiating with RCEP, including India. So these mega FTAs are all going on. And so the laborers are under kind of comfortable situations where the whole peoples are employed in Japan. It's a kind of all-in situations. Now women are working, and seniors are after 65 years, they're working. Probably they would be working until they die, hopefully, keeping their good health. And even the disabled persons are starting to participate in the labor market. So basically, everybody is working now. And but there's lots of frictions on it. If women continues to keep working, they need somebody to help their kids or babies, or somebody to help for the old parents who cannot work anymore. So there's a huge demand for nursery cares. So without that, we'll be able to continue to increase the labor input anymore. So then the government finally have started to focus on the labor productivities. It's not labor input, but more labor productivities. And then we find lots of place for reform. So this is the kind of evolution. So if you see that the green part shows the ordinary revenue of Japanese companies, number 4 from the bottom of number 4 columns from the bottom is ordinary revenues. It's just almost more than double, nearly double. So well, probably it should be doubles if compared to 2012 in Japan this year. So the corporate sector is doing fine. The Nikkei average was just pushed up. I mean, the last figures in 2017, you should add 0. I just missed the 0. So we are in crisis if Nikkei is doing this one. So corporate sector is doing fine, and they are financial assets swollen. So they have family, household financial assets is just swollen, that's okay. And but the other parts, we definitely have some missing link. no matter how the companies are doing fine, the nominal wage never picked up, and the number of employees has been increased, but the pace is very slow. And we have many new entrants into the labor market, women, seniors, and disabled persons. Those people are ended up in irregular work rather than the regular work. And it's never like that. They wish to have a regular work, but they can't do it. But some part is rather they really themselves opt to take the irregular work. And because they can't so much committed to like a person's who from 9 o'clock to even 10 o'clock in Japanese standard. It's really difficult for a housewife or the mothers or the seniors to do that. So the irregular workers are increasing, but the regular workers are not increasing that much. And then, but of course, since the wage never picks up, that's never really stimulates the consumptions in Japan, and that's the strategy. So as time goes by, Abenomics first started from the kind of regulatory reform, deregulations, and corporate tax reductions to compete with the many companies globally. And we've been pushing a lot of corporate reform based on the investor-centered kind of governance. We have a lot of programs on it. So we are doing it. And these kind of reforms are the major part of Abenomics to push up the economies as a macro basis. And then as time goes by, many people have started to scream about the real growth strategies. And so now healthcare and nurseries is regarded as a kind of strategic industry for us in various terms. And the Industrial 4.0, we are desperate about it. And telecom, logics, fintech, next generations of supply chain management, energy sharing economies, and these are all mushrooming up. And government is quite ready to pushing these economies. But the real important issues is the last part of these columns, like human capital, women empowerment, working style reform, and the education reform is a result. And these are the process. So the thing is, why we are doing fine, but still the wage never goes up? And this should be a common trend among the mature economies and the falling labor. Well, after all, when we think about the wage, the increases, there can be a lot of factors that it affects the wage. But of course, labor productivity is one thing, and the labor share is one thing. Because if the companies, since they have a huge revenue, if they are ready to distribute the revenues into whole employees, naturally the wage goes up. And the other reasons for the wage to go up is inflationary expectation. But inflationary expectations is totally ruined in Japan after the bubble collapse. So that's why Abenomics has been combating with the deflationary pressures. But if you look at this, many people think, Japan is the only country who's working so bad among the mature economies. But the patterns of wage increase, the speed of which increase falls, is a quite common phenomenon among the mature economies. Well, if you look at the shape, the falling wage per hour, this is quite similar with Japan and Germany. And it started in early 2000. Well, probably must have started earlier a little bit. But the late 1990s, after 2000, there was enormous falls in which continues to, the wage is still increasing, but the speed tends to be very slow. So, but what difference is, in terms of Germany, they've never still so much deflationary like in Japan, but inflation expectation was the most important part for Japan still to prevent the wage goes up. So this is the situation. So if we are too serious about the push up the wage, Well, of course, the biggest issues is the change, the inflation expectations, and that's why Abenomics 1 tackled with. But unfortunately, there's no other policy options from economic theory. So we don't know how we can do any more. We don't know. And the other option is to change the labor share. And since companies are doing fine, they should distribute the revenues to employees, but they're never really ready to do that. Why? Because, well, we are still in a catching up process for the equity holder-based governance. So the company has to share more for the equity holders rather than the workers. So, I mean, employees. So the options is limited, and of course the third options is for the greater labor shares is also limited. And also we are under the very kind of negative environment in terms of technologies. Labor substitution technologies are mushrooming up, and we are afraid of some kind of gig economies. One takes, winner takes everything, that kind of economics. And the globalization, of course, we have to compete with many rising new economies. So the chances for the wage to go up is quite limited. So then finally what's left for the, at least for the policymakers is just pushing up the labor productivity. And fortunately, we have many rooms to do that. So that's why the government has started to be very serious. So there's very natural pressures for Japan to be serious about the labor reform. One is demographic. Well, after all, no matter how we try to increase the labor input, that should be limited without immigrants. So productivity is the most important thing. And of course, we are in global competitions. We need more entrepreneurs, talents. So that's why human capital should be their last asset. And if compared to, in terms of AI or IT vendors that's supposed to sustain the whole digitalized economies, is the IT capacity in Japan is very weak. And we've been very much dependent on India's or other human resources. But compared to US or China, the big countries, the IT capacities is very much limited in terms of volumes. So let's focus it. And then education reform. That is, well, Japan has too many universities like in Korea. So we are under the strong pressures to restructure the whole structures. But then there's a lot of Japanese specific backgrounds for the sticky wedge. So first, the labor mobility is very low, and the managers are so much committed to still their long-term employment. So no matter how we suffer the labor shortage, the incentives for the managers to increase the wage to maintain the talented staff is very weak. Well, after all, they continue to work. And institutionally, Japan is very much committed to the pension system, and that is also very much based on the long-term employment. There is no incentive for the workers to quit and go somewhere. And the second issue is Japanese intra-firm labor market is very well developed. So if someone cannot find a good job, well, they can transfer those people to somewhere else inside the firms. And that's why Japan has been, well, the system in Japan is more for the profit or the money, but for the peoples to keep working, and that sort of a values is quite very strong among the Japanese old managers. So that's the second thing. And also, managers are very afraid of pushing up the wages, because once you committed to the wages, it's very difficult to cut it down again. So we never want to do it again, so let's keep it as it is. And that sort of ideas is quite strong. And that's why the deflationary mind is still very much ruling the Japanese business societies. And there's another institutional constraint, especially for women, to be full-time workers in the labor market, because, well, Japan used to be very much supporting the housewife because that's an ideal place for women, and even working women are paying some part of the social security for the housewives. So we are very much bashed. And so we have to need reform these kind of things. And irregular workers, part-time workers, and foreign workers. The good news is, since we are suffering from the labor shortage so much, finally the wage of the irregular workers, part-time workers have started to increase much faster than the regular workers. So this is a good news, because the managers are under the strong pressures. So if these irregular workers are as costly as the regular workers, why don't we switch them into a regular workers? And that's why the situation is very natural. So, but there's other things. So retirement age is officially extended to 65. So the wage curves is getting flatter, and that is pressures. There are people in late 30s to 40s in their peak of their career. They should be more compensated, but since they have to support the older one, we have to make some arrangement for the lowered, flattened wage curves. And other issues why the wage never goes up is a lot of new entrants into the labor market goes to a nursery, educations, and these fields. And since these fields are not marketized fully, and of course we are under the national kind of Medicare system, these they cannot pay such a high wage for those workers in these service sectors. So there are many Japan-specific reasons. So, but anyway, we have to be more focused on labor reform in order to keep the growth. So, what the government is trying to do is some comprehensive labor reform approach. One is to regulate the overtime hours. Well, Japan has been working so hard, too much, and their labor productivity was low. So why don't we cut out the official overtime work? At least the maximum should be 45 hours per month. Still, this is very long, and if compared to the European standard, probably. And the second issue is there should be some discretionary working system for professionals. And, well, they are not the factory workers, so this should be some special framework for the professionals. And the third one is, well, after all, we have to go to some equal payment for equal work. So no matter how people work as regular workers and regular workers, if people are doing the same job, they should be paid in the same standard. So this is what we've seen. Well, unfortunately, there's been a kind of change because the irregular workers have already seen as I said, faster growth of wage. So the gap between the regular workers and regular workers have substantially narrowed by the market, not by the government regulations, but let's admit it as our policies, and this continues to make an effort. And of course, Social Security, how there are many people who ruined as a severe competitions. So mental care and nursery service for the workers should be more focused, and that's a lot of things discussed. So, but of course, we have a lot of limitations, a lot of problems, and reform needs time. How far and how fast? And Japanese employment system is not job-based one like a European and US system. And it's more like a membership employment, how you're committed to Mitsubishi or Mitsui, etc. And since we have a lot changing into diversity management, we hired a lot of foreigners who never speak a word of Japanese already, and women as a minorities, and the handicapped, seniors, etc. There should be it should be far easier to have a kind of diversity management under the job-based system. What you contracted is this job for this payment, so you should do this. But membership system is very difficult to accept this diversity management. So, but on the other hand, the reasons why we could have adapted in such a deflationary aging speed is, well, still the Japanese management has been somewhat far more flexible in terms of the people's job. So the chances that people lose the job right away because the job is disappeared is very much limited, and that's why there's still discussions going on. And also, role of in-house training, it should be focused again because, well, that's also related with the problems of the Korean college graduate who comes to Japan to seek for a job. And what the Japanese company values is not like a kind of Korean academic exam performance or the academic background, which university you graduate. Well, they never really so much excited about this thing. The question is, what did you do when you were a student? And what was your most exciting experience in your life? Well, I did so well in such an exam did not mean anything at all for Japanese firms. So still, the companies are ready to invest into the human capital by company basis. But we have to refocus this cost. And of course, there are many vested interest groups trying to go against it. Oh, this is a man's world. Why we have to pick up the women managerial positions, and this kind of sentiment still remains. So we just climb up the ladder after long time efforts and dedications. Why don't we? Because she is appointed as a woman. This kind of pressures is still there. And other things is a huge issues. Is reform needs money, and we are suffering from a huge debt by the government. So who pays the whole subsidies for subsidies for free educations, high schools and higher education even. So who's going to pay for the subsidy? No one knows. And the tax base in Japan is far smaller if compared to the Europeans and the US system. And there are many people who never pay taxes at all because saying, oh, we are poor, why don't you go to some other richer guys to pick up the tax? So this kind of, we have to broaden their narrow tax if they are so much committed to educations because this is not business. And after all, the final fight for the politicians especially is the so-called silver democracies. Well, since voters, one man, one vote, well, all peoples have better votes, so why politicians can be so serious about the future generations? Well, nothing. So this is kind of battles. So I think time is going up, so we cut this. So finally, Japan-Korea labor mobility as a corporation. Well, many people have already sought and got a job in Japan. More than 20,000 new graduate find a job in Japan already. And the government is very cooperative or pushing these ideas against Japan. And probably the mind of Korean younger generation must have changed. Well, in ancient time, many graduates tried to find a job in big companies in Korea, and the second tier is the Europeans and US companies because of the early promotions in the careers and maybe better paid. And the second, Japanese company was on the third tier, frankly. But finally, they've started to understand, well, this is a very secure job. Unless you do something totally wrong, you're allowed to continue to seek for the career, so it's worth. So, well, that's a change. And what the Japanese company values against the young, fresh graduates is very different, as I've explained. And so, in my sense, the politically motivated myopic corporations for the younger generations is not so much good enough for Japan-Korea relations as a whole. So I think we should be more focused on the corporations for sharing growth. And the employment rate should follow as a result of sharing growth naturally. So we should be more positively compete in good policy making, and the bilateral pressures is a good asset for us to continue the reform. And also the geo-economies is a good thing. So we have now 7 million of Korean tourists in Japan, and they're doing fine. And I think there should be some new startup ventures to keep these inbound tourists, and many Japanese should go to, well, we've already gone to Pyeongchang, but we should push up this kind of exchange more, and the service sectors is a sector that we need, both needs better productivity. So the human capital exchange should be more professional based. So entrepreneurs, ventures, IT professionals, skilled workers, education and healthcare service, maybe civic engineers. And we are going to have Society 5.0 to extend the health life expectancies. And we are going to innovate such a transportation system enormously, because there are many people who cannot even go to some retail shop nearby. So the automatic driving is very much an experiment and should be ready until Tokyo Olympics in 2020. So this kind of innovations is going on. And the next generation supply chain system actually creates a very strategic locations for Japanese manufacturers, and they are going to cover this whole IT-based manufacturing system, including Korea. So there should be some discussions to talk about the potential cooperation. And finally, infrastructures, integrated constructions like 3D survey drones, or etc. And these new technologies are constantly in experiment. And finally, civic, since we both societies is rapidly aging, so I think Korea can experiment, and Korea can learn the experience from Japan how to manage the super age society in a short period. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you very much for the gracious invitation, Dr. Il-suk-kong, to be with you this morning. I remember we were together as we discussed over breakfast in 2007, 8, and 9, when the world seemed to be falling apart, and you were very much at the center of things, making sure they didn't, and you managed the G20 summit in Seoul with such success. And I was thinking this morning as we were walking over, the first time I had the pleasure of addressing this forum, and so it's a little bit like a homecoming this morning, so thank you very much. It's good to meet a lot of new people and to see some old friends. And I have a long fascination with Japan, and so Japan is facing some of the issues today that, as we just heard, many countries will face in the future. So in a sense, Japan is this laboratory that Professor Fukagawa has just talked about. And in that sense, though Japan is no longer the leading economic player in Asia, its transition, it makes it a laboratory that we should all be watching very closely. This morning I thought I could talk about 2 or 3 things. There's so much we could talk about. I met an old friend last night for dinner, late dinner, and I said, there's so much going on in Korea. And he said, yeah, if this Me Too movement keeps going, we don't know what's going to happen. I thought there was something else on people's minds, you see. So you never really know. So first of all, I'd like to talk about how the policy matrix, or the policy set that's been in place in the world economy essentially over the last several years, is now shifting quite sharply, and what could be some of the implications of that. Number 2, I'd like to focus in particular in that regard on the United States, because they're sort of leading that shift, and that shift is perhaps more exaggerated there than elsewhere because of the commitments that Trump has made and his convictions. And thirdly, I'd like to speak a little bit on China and conclude about, I was going to say how we can make some money, but rather how we can avoid losing it this year. So we have been through 2017, you're afraid that's going to fall? We have been in a period of synchronized growth. in virtually the entire world economy with few exceptions. But I ask myself, is there a soft underbelly to that synchronized growth that's now starting to come to the surface? You had the fourth quarter in Korea that surprised some people. That wasn't quite as strong as some had expected, especially quarter on quarter. Japan's fourth quarter was weaker than expected. The US, many people were forecasting 3% growth for fourth quarter, and looking at 3% higher growth, maybe even a little bit higher than 3% this year. Doesn't seem to be happening. Australia reported weaker numbers than are expected. Some of the European countries reported good numbers, but a few, including Germany, reported weaker than expected. So I just wonder if beneath the surface here we aren't starting to see some of the soft, if there's not some softness out there. The leading indicators, which typically lead the world economy by 9 to 12 months, have stopped rising, and in some countries now have started rolling over. So I put that on the table because if we look at other indicators, if we look at PMI indicators, if we look at corporate confidence and other measures, if we look at consumer confidence, in many countries they're at record peaks. And typically when we get to a record peak, you don't keep going, you sometimes correct. And so although central banks seem to have this fascination and this preoccupation with inflation, in reality, with again exceptions, we aren't seeing this big pickup in inflation that everyone has been expecting. So I think central banks, as we move through this year, are probably going to have to be more careful in monetary policy than maybe a lot of us still expect them to be. Particularly because we've been through 10 years, quote unquote, of delevering, but actually through the last 10 years, debt in the world economy has continued to rise. It's not just government debt. In fact, in many countries, government debt's not the issue. It's gross debt, corporate debt, and in the household sector. So if we do have a sharper increase in interest rates, and we have to be very careful about how to manage that debt load that's out there at the same time. But the Fed is obviously the most advanced in going from quantitative easing to I guess you could say quantitative contraction. The ECB probably by this fall will be moving in that direction. BOJ, who knows when they're going to move. And the PBOC continues to be, I think, stronger and tougher than some people imagine. So first of all, the whole monetary mix is starting to shift somewhat, and to shift even dramatically in some places. But the real focus is on how other policies are changing, particularly in the US. And there are four key areas, I think, that we have to think about: fiscal policy, regulation, immigration, and trade. So on the fiscal policy front, the big tax changes the US has announced, I believe, are going to force other countries to follow. I mean, if you're Canada, for example, or Mexico, and you don't follow fairly closely the US tax policies, companies are going to put into a situation where they have to judge between a higher tax rate or lower tax rate where they're going to invest. And so there will be a ripple effect, I believe, around the world of US fiscal policy changes impacting the rest of us. People are arguing that this cut of the corporate rate in particular from 35 to 21% is like pouring oil on a fire. We'll have to see where that fire goes. One of the consequences of this fiscal policy is to add about $1.5 trillion to the US debt. And so we're going to see a surge in the US twin deficits, right? The trade deficit and the fiscal deficit. And so the question is, how is that tax cut going to be used? And then think through what a surge in the U.S. trade deficit is going to mean in the context where you have a president who's already banging the drum of protectionism. Well, of the tax cuts, I think about 50% of it's going back into share buybacks. So, you know, the U.S. government is saying much of this will go into capital investment. Actually, I don't believe that. I think another 25% goes into increased dividends. And if you know that the top 10% in America owned 84% of equities, you can see the consequence of these policies. It's not trickle down, it's going to be trickle up, maybe. I would say 15% goes into capital investment, and the remainder goes into wages. There's been a lot of talk about these special bonuses that were paid towards the end of last year and up wage rates in over the end of the year. But these bonuses are like in Japan. They're, you know, it's one time. It's not an increase in the base salary. So as we saw in the labor numbers released at the end of last week, we saw a very strong labor market in terms of new jobs, but we didn't see the growth in wages was minimum. In fact, the growth in real wages was negative. So I don't expect much of this tax cut to be going directly into wages, and not a lot of it going directly into investment. It's going to go largely into this financial play. And so I wonder if the fear that so many of us have that these tax cuts are going to lead to a surge in inflation are actually well-founded, because that whole argument is based on rising wages, and I question whether that's actually going to happen. If we look at U6 in the United States, that is the broader measure of unemployment, it's still around 8%. And as we saw last week in the numbers, people are starting now to participate more in the labor market, and the numbers are starting to go up again. So my sense is the U.S. still has some reserve of labor that we're underestimating. Is it skilled labor, like many companies require? No. So that will oblige companies to invest more in education. But on the whole, I am less skeptical that the fiscal policy is going to lead to a sharp pop in economic growth. And I'm also of the view that it's going to lead, as I said, to a sharp increase in the deficit and in the trade deficit. So that then brings me to the second policy at the center of what's going on in the U.S. It's deregulation. It's broad. It's happening in many sectors. And I think as we move through the rest of this year, we will see deregulation focused increasingly on the financial sector. The view of many in the financial sector, and particularly in this government, is that the banks are today capitalized as if there was another 2007 crisis going to happen tomorrow, and therefore the banks are heavily overcapitalized, and regulation just has to be reduced so banks can disgorge some of this capital, which will go to share buybacks and increase dividends. Of course, the official line is that it will go into increased lending. We will see about that. I'm rather more skeptical on that. We've seen also a hard push on deregulation in the energy sector. And that, I believe, will continue. We see also a hard push on all kinds of regulation with regard to environment, health, right to work. So basically, those two business see as positive. The fiscal policy business sees as positive, and deregulation is positive. The third one, immigration, business sees as much less positive. I'm on the board of a big U.S. industrial company. We have at any one time 1,000, 1,200 jobs we can't fill. We need skilled engineers, technicians, people with computer science background. The consequence is that we find these people in China and India. We can't find them in Europe. But because of the immigration complications now, that's leading us to invest more in China and India than we would otherwise be doing. It's easy to say, well, we'll change the education system, but you know that's a long-term process. The government is, or at least Trump is talking about going to a points-based immigration system like the Canadians have. Again, that's very unlikely to happen, at least anytime soon. So I think the immigration side is going to remain through this administration a big problem for business. Now let's move then to the trade front, which is a problem not just it's a problem for everybody in a sense. I don't think there's any chance of the U.S. joining TPP anytime soon. I think the new TPP agreement stripped out many of the key issues, key elements that the former U.S. government wanted to see in TPP. And if they were put back in, I'm not sure that everyone who signed up to it now would stay in. NAFTA, of course, is up for negotiation. There are 30 chapters in the NAFTA negotiations. I think they've come to broadly an agreement on 6. And the heavy lifting is still ahead of us. A key point in this and the WTO that Trump is now constantly attacking is the dispute resolution mechanism. And the U.S. current government believes that the dispute resolution mechanism in NAFTA and WTO generates results that are typically unfavorable to the United States and therefore has to be changed. The Canadians and the Mexicans have a very different view, as do many people in the WTO. And of course, your agreement with the United States, your quote-unquote free trade agreement with the United States, is also in the bullseye that Trump is looking at for similar reasons. It's easy to score points on Trump with regard to trade. But it's more complicated to shrug off, the creator of the theory of free trade, David Ricardo. Because Ricardo wrote that his theory was pretty and polite. It's a pretty and polite theory, he wrote. But he said in reality, it probably will never work universally, because my theory, he wrote, supposes the unhindered free movement of capital and labor. It assumes perfect mobility. And he wrote, that's unlikely ever to happen. And I think in reality that is where we are. The issue is not free trade per se, in my view. The issue is who benefits from the trade agreements that we have and who doesn't. And Trump has captured the electorate that doesn't. And whatever he does, whatever he says, remember he said I could go on to Fifth Avenue and shoot someone and I wouldn't lose any votes? That electorate is deeply, deeply attached to his positions. How, whatever you think of them, and we all probably have our own ideas on them, that electorate is very committed to him. And you saw, some of you may have seen his speech on the weekend in Pennsylvania, 25,000 people going nuts, him sort of ad-libbing, and he has captured that class in America of people who believe they haven't benefited from free trade. Having met Trump a few times, I think the way he operates is to set out a negotiating position before he gets into the negotiations. I think he tries to make it, he tries to get in your head, to make you believe that you have more to lose by not doing a deal than doing the deal he's proposing to you. So on steel and aluminum, and on others, I see this as part of a larger negotiating ploy. Because after all, I think there's there are very severe limits to how far the US can go in these policies. Think of it. How are executives compensated in the US? Now they get a base salary, but essentially with stock options and shares. The 10%, as I mentioned, wealthiest Americans own 84% of shares. The trauma to the US economy of going from an economy that's a big importer to one that isn't importing nearly as much as it's importing today and exporting much more, the impact would be traumatic on the US economy. Prices would go up, unemployment would go up. I think asset values would go down, interest rates would go up in a context where gross debt in the US economy today is around $420 billion. I just don't think the US has the stomach for that. It would have to go through a 10-year restructuring that, I mean, you would need, it's interesting to see the term limits to be president in China have just been dropped. And Trump said the other day, well, maybe we should look at that. Because you would need a leader who's in power for a very long time, not having to face elections, to drive the changes that would go with an aggressive protectionist policy in the United States. So I think there are limits to how far this can go. I think we have to treat it very seriously. I think we have to negotiate very hard. But I think that this is a dog that's barking. His bark is worse than his bite's going to be. I'll leave it there and we maybe come back in discussion. On China, we're going through, I think, you know, it's pretty simple. China's going to be bigger than anything we've ever seen. And when you're big, you take a lot of space. China's simply going to take a lot of space, and the US pulling back as the way as it is maybe making it a little easier for that to happen. China's economy, in my view, peaked cyclically in the third quarter last year. This year they'll be squeezing it, and maybe a little bit next year, but that's in the context of a world economy that's doing okay, so I don't think it's going to have a big impact in pushing down the world economy. China will still generate 30-35% of total world growth this year. So I see China as cyclically having peaked, but is structurally quite stable. There's big discussion and preoccupation about the leverage the economy is carrying. Total debt in the Chinese economy is about 260% of GDP, compared with Japan, 580% if you take gross debt. The US, as I said, 420. It's sometimes difficult to compare exactly, because China, as we all know, corporate finance coming from indirect finance, that is from capital markets, is a very tiny part of corporate finance. It's about 5% from quarter to quarter. 95% of company financing is either self-provided, retained earnings, or bank-provided. Whereas the US, for example, about 30% of company finance comes from banks, and the rest comes from direct finance. So it's difficult to compare directly. Number two, the corporate debt of the 260% is said to be around 160%. But of that 160%, I would consider about 40% to be directly government debt. And I would consider another 40% to be effectively equity, given the rates that companies are paying for it. So if there's a big crisis, that 40% that's effectively equity would be converted into equity, as we saw happen in the 1990s with debt to equity swaps. So that would put corporate debt down to around 90% of GDP, 80% of GDP, real corporate debt, which in an economy that's growing nominally at 8.5%, 9%, real 6%, profits at quite high levels currently, I think that that's not going to destabilize things dramatically. It's a country that has strong leadership. If you've been following the meetings in Beijing, we have, very detailed program for 2020, 2025, 2035, 2049. And this build-out, if we look at the world from Beijing and we turn your back to the Pacific, what you see are 4 or 5 billion people who, if they adopted policies similar to those that have levered China's growth over the last 35 years, those economies would also see some very strong growth, and hence this whole BRI project. So on the China front, I'm quite optimistic. The key issue internationally is going to be how China and the US play this trade game. And it will not be pretty as we move through much of the next 2 or 3 years. But I think the two countries, I think Trump has understood that he has to somehow work with China in despite of the strategy paper that was put out recently that identified China and Russia as, quote, competitors. I think Trump has understood that he has to work with China and somehow, yes, frictions, but somehow work through these issues. So let me conclude and ask the question: how do we make money, or how do we not lose our money this year? I think bond markets are in a long-term bear market. We've had a 35-year, 37-year bull market. There's lots of new supply coming on the market, so be very careful about bonds, or about bonds in general. There are some exceptions. Equities, I think emerging markets have good profit momentum. Governments have orthodox fiscal and monetary policies in most emerging markets, so I would be more focused on them. I happen to be one of those who thinks that commodity prices are going to end up being stronger rather than weaker because of the severe supply cutbacks that have occurred, particularly in investment cutbacks that have occurred in energy in particular, and therefore supply cutbacks. So as I look at the world this year, it's going to be one of instability, which comes from these changing policy mix. It's going to be one where there's a lot of noise about trade. It's going to be a world where there's, as part of this protectionism that's rising, there's going to be more barriers to capital flows. We're going to hear a lot of talk also about how Europe's going to be reorganized with Brexit and the new populism. But so I think this is a year where you're going to have to be very agile. You're going to have to be very attentive. And as I look at the world from Seoul, it's going to be a year that's going to be extraordinarily important, and for the rest of the world, fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Since we have only 15 minutes left, let me just invite questions from the floor. Any questions?
With you two distinguished speakers, I'm very tempted to ask questions to both of you, but in the interest of fairness to the rest, I'll just ask a question to Dr. Courtis only, because it's been such a long time I had a chance to hear you talk. First question. Even in early water, as early as 20 years ago, we had been raising concerns about Japan's debt level. You have not mentioned much danger about China. What do you think of China's financial situation, particularly very non-transparent, opaque nature of their debt situations? And the second question is on the trade. Economists may have all kinds of arguments about themselves, but one area they almost unanimously agreed was the benefit of free trade. And then now comes this President Donald Trump, which puts a very fast brake on it and he urges this opposite direction. Now, he is surrounding himself with Navarro and Uberos. Those are very, very anti-free trade people. What do you think? You said that this is a problem, but politically, as you say, he gets very, very solid support from the voters who like him. So how does the U.S. Political system work out this theoretically very dangerous course, but yet supported very strongly by the supporters of Trump? Thank you.
The two areas in China's finances which I find the most problematic are what's going on at the municipality level and the relationship between local companies and municipalities and cross guarantees. I think that's a swamp. I don't think my discussion with all kinds of people up and down the country, I don't think that the authorities fully have a full grasp at all of that. And so that's one area that I'm concerned about. And secondly, the funds management, quote unquote, sector, which includes trust products, and that's also a quite murky area. So they are the two trouble points that I see in what you call the opaque, levered sector. But broadly, I'm not that concerned systemically. First, because the overall debt load is high, but it's small relative to other countries. Secondly, we do have pretty strong leadership. Third, the country still is able to generate 8% nominal growth, which over time helps you absorb some of that. But you were right to highlight this opaque area. I would particularly put my finger on those two areas, and you'll have to watch very carefully how they evolve. With regard to trade, it's Trump, as we saw in the Italian elections, the populists who are still strong in Europe, and who knows, they may come back stronger. And this will surely not be a pleasant ride. This will be unpleasant trade negotiations. He wants to reopen the treaty with you, like they've done with the Canadians and the Mexicans, like he wants to do with others. I think there's zero prospect of any international trade deal, which the U.S. is part of, not being put into question. And I think there's very little prospect of any new trade deal occurring. So this is not going to be pleasant. But I think there's a limit on how far the U.S. can push. It is true that he has a base of about 30-35% that is rock solid. It doesn't matter how many Stormy Daniels come out of the woodwork, that is still going to remain, I believe, solid. It is also the case that the opposition only talks about Trump and isn't in the process clearly putting out a program to mobilize the electorate, so he could well get re-elected in 2020. In fact, he's fully mobilized on that now. But I believe that the corporate sector and people who are influential in the United States have enough at stake in the current system that in the end they will outweigh the protectionism. That's my wager. And my wager is that if the U.S. really pushed hard in these areas, for example, and his speech in Pennsylvania over the weekend that some of you may have watched, he talked about BMW and Daimler and the Germans hiding behind the euro. It's right to a certain extent. Then he says, look, there's a 10% tax tariff on US cars exported to Germany, and we have 2.5% tax. I don't know if that's true, but he says a lot of things. But let's assume it's true. Well, if that's the case, that's going to have to be resolved. That's going to have to be resolved. Either he's going to increase the tax to 10%, or the Germans are going to have to make a deal. The Europeans will have to make a deal. So things like that, yes, but I don't see any all-out broad protectionism. What I would be more afraid of is an aggressive attempt to devalue the dollar. And you heard Mnuchin when he was at Davos a few weeks ago saying we should have a week. The dollar's too strong. That the euro and the yen are far too weak. There's a big boom in tourism. We just heard of Koreans going to Japan. One of the reasons is because Japan's not so expensive anymore. I still have an apartment in Tokyo. My rent has not changed since 1991. I love it. I love stable prices. Central bankers call it deflation. I call it stable prices. But I would watch also for the U.S. to be more aggressive on trying to drive the dollar down.
Well, I have questions to each of our two distinguished speakers. First, Fukagawa-san, very informative, and thank you very much for sharing the labor sector reform in Japan. In fact, many Koreans, including myself, really admire great success of the Abenomics has achieved, especially with respect to the labor sector reform. I know that the Mr. Abe attempted to push it through the really labor market flexibility, calling for a flexible layoff of regular workers, and also introducing the performance of merit-based wage hike system. But I know that that sort of scheme, have not succeeded in because of the political and labor union opposition. On the other hand, you still achieved sort of equal payment for same job, regardless of the regular workers or irregular workers. That's sort of things we really need to achieve as far as Korea labor sector reform is. My question is that the ABS still continue to try to the labor market flexibility. I mean the layoffs of regular workers and also performance wage system. And second question is that how the Japanese labor union play out their political positions in terms of formulating national the macroeconomic policy, or in Korea, as you know, labor union plays a dominant role in shaping up the national economic policy and so forth. And then Mr. Courtis, the President Trump imposed the safeguard tariff on the steel product, but he exempted Canada, Mexico, because they are NAFTA partners. And further, I think the other day he also exempted Australia, because Australia is an ally of the United States. So my question is that Korea and the United States, a military ally, no question about that, especially in the face of the North Korean nuclear threat. My question is that Korea can work for exemption of the tariff imposition of the iron steel product, as the Australia succeeded. Is it feasible? Is it feasible? Yeah, I mean, Korea could be exempted by the imposition of tariff on the steel product. Survival of Korean steel companies really not at stake if the current imposition goes on.
Thank you very much for the questions. I know that Dr. An is very knowledgeable about what's happening in Japan too, so maybe he knows much better than I. At least at this moment, well, as you know, Abe is now in a big scandal, and we won't be very much surprised if he had to quit this year because this is the election year for Labour Democratic Party. So, well, maybe other guys will be taking over his position, maybe, but the impact on the so-called economics won't change that much because, well, there's so many options for Japan anymore, and we started at gambles and we have to win this, otherwise we're going to ruin. And no one wants to go back to the dark Democratic Party of Japan's time, so where they are very much based on the labor unions, but that also relates with the other questions that the labor union in Japan has got so weaker than before. And it used to be weaker, but it got even more weaker as usual. Partly because of the change in the labor market. So now what we are trying to pass the law is on the so-called freelance workers. And it's very common to have somebody to get a job through the internet order, so that how we can protect these so-called self-employed people through the internet. So they are not unionized at all. So those people are increasing in number, so their working styles has changed so fast. So that's one reason. And the other reasons is that, well, Japanese unions is very different from Korea. They have no special ideologies to fight against the capitalists or the investors. This kind of mentality is very weak. That's in some sense something kind of historical, evolutional kind of things in Japan. So we've been all gone through a lot of economic crisis for a number of times. But through the process, the managers have been committed so much about maintaining the jobs for everybody. So sometimes we fail, but still the learning or the lessons that the union learns is, after all, cooperating with the managers is a nice thing, basically, for them. So it's not myopic, self-interest kind of labor unions are quite limited in Japan. So as long as the labor market is very much taken, and there's no fear for anybody to lose the job instantly, the union is very much cooperative, especially the big unions. So I think the situation is very different. But in the meantime, it's not the economics, but it's wholly the change in the demographic structures. So I think about 10 years after in Korea, I'm pretty sure that we are going to suffer from labor shortage. Well, labor mismatch will continue, but the labor shortage in terms of amount will be quite, well, looks quite short. That's the situation.
I think the exemption of the Canadians and Mexicans is part of the negotiation within NAFTA. The Australians, I think, is a special case because Australia doesn't have much of a steel industry, and its main steel company actually has bigger operations in the US than it has in Australia. So I think there's some discussion with Turnbull and Trump on that. As far as you're concerned, I think there's no simple answer. I think that, of course, you have to focus on Trump and Ross and other people directly involved. But I would also, this is really hard work, but focus a lot on business, focus a lot on state governments, on governors. We had a diplomatic pressure group operation. I would focus on the bureaucracy, the federal bureaucracy, because a lot of it doesn't buy into this. And even senior people in the administration. don't buy into this. As you saw last week when the economic advisor resigned. Having worked with several of these people in my former banking career, I know that many of them don't agree with these policies. It's not easy work, but I think you have to work the system at all levels, and the sooner you start and the more persistent you are, the more likely you're to be successful. The Europeans could argue that they're allies of the Americans. The Japanese could argue that they're allies of the Americans. I would make that argument. I'd use any argument, but I would focus on the real economic costs and benefits, and I would do that at every level you can, because you have to build that pressure. Otherwise, I don't see how you can do it. Because Trump's mind is pretty much set up, but he's a politician as well, right? So that's how I would see that. And I would also, see that in the framework of him wanting to renegotiate, quote unquote, the U.S.-Korean trade agreement. Again, I see him as setting out, his position to later negotiate on it.
Make it very short, please.
Okay. I'd like to ask to Dr. Courtis. I think that there is not a single Korean that wants President Donald Trump be re-elected at the next election. But we have to prepare that. In that case, how would you recommend, how would you suggest the Koreans to stand up in the torrential reign of Donald Trump? This is my first question. And my next question is, the current trade protectionism is unprecedented after the Second World War. And according to our memory, after the severe protective measures, we had a very unhappy, great World War, the Second World War. We don't expect war in this modern age, but I'd like to ask you, after Donald Trump, what would be the world order in economics or global trade, military or diplomatic after Donald Trump? What would you envision the future after Donald Trump? That's my second question.
Wow, that's the world after Donald Trump. I'm still trying to understand what the world of Donald Trump is itself. I think you're right. I haven't seen any opinion polls on Korea, but I can agree. My intuition says that your assessment is right. And I think you're also right not to underestimate the probability of Trump being reelected, believe it or not. As we go into the 2018 congressional elections, Trump is going to be able to say, look, I cut your taxes, you're getting 3% growth, I cut back regulations, you got some bonuses, I told you I'd be hard on these people who are cheating us in other countries, so I've hit steel and I've hit aluminum and I'll hit a few other things. I want to build that wall, but the Democrats keep blocking me, so you're going to have to give me more support in Congress so I can kick out, get rid of these Democrats who are making life difficult for you. I've gotten rid of not Al-Qaeda, what do you call it? Daesh, Islamic State. Since I've been elected, they've disappeared. I held a summit with the first one ever with North Korea, and we're going to get that problem solved. That's how I see him talking going into the election. And normally, given his popularity rating, his party would lose many seats. It'll be interesting to watch very carefully the elections that are taking place in Pennsylvania today, because that's a seat, a district that he won by 20% over Clinton? Does the Republicans win it this time by a reduced margin? Do they lose it? Then it would be a sign that there's real trouble ahead. So the issue isn't just Trump protectionism, because there'll be reactions to that, right? The Europeans have already announced reactions. And still in Europe, you have people controlling things at the policy level who are very committed to free trade, relative free trade. But behind them, there's a populist movement building up, as we've just seen in Italy, as we see with Brexit, that is less committed to free trade. The irony of all of this is that China has become the main proponent of free trade in the world. So I don't know what the world looks like post-Donald Trump. But I think there's a limit to how far the US will go on protectionism. But I think, as I said, we have to be prepared for a bumpy ride over the next few years until we get to this post-Trump world and think about what it will look like.
Okay, it's been a fascinating discussion. I'd like to, as much as you would like to continue this discussion, but time's up. And we have these two speakers have introduced to give immediately after this, and Professor Fukagawa has to rush back to the airport to catch a flight. So with this, why don't we express our very deep appreciation to the two speakers in our usual way. Thank you very much.
See your presentation.
Well, before we end, I just want to say that I just wish we had more time so that we can share more of the very, very insightful views and your thoughts. Actually, this morning we had 한노총 위원장이 있다고 지금 조금 전에 떠나셨는데 김주영 한노총 위원장 지난번 우리 독일 그 노동시장 개혁했던 미스터 할스가 왔을 때도 오셨고 또 오늘도 와서 특히 후카가와 교수 레버 마켓 리폼 이야기하는 걸 아주 관심 있게 듣고 와서 아주 일본의 노사 관계가 아주 정책하는 분들과 또 노조와 아주 협조적인 관계를 강조를 하는데 좀 도움이 됐으면 좋겠습니다. Well, I just said I wish we just had more time, but they had a busy schedule, so we have to end the meeting now. And I hope we'll have more opportunities to bring them back again. And I'm sure Fukagawa, Professor Fukagawa is nearby, so we sure can visit us more. But I will try to get Ken Courtis come to Seoul more often. By the way, next week I will have Professor Martin Feldstein, a friend of mine for many, many years, is again briefly visiting Seoul on his way to China. So please make a note, next Tuesday morning, and Professor Martin Feldstein will be with us. And maybe with this, we have to end. As Dr. Song said, please join me in thanking to distinguished speakers and to share their very, very enlightening views. Thank you very much.